Okay, so I think we've reached the allotted time, so I will get started. Lovely to have so many of you here, some names that I recognise, and also lots of new people to meet, so that's great. I'm Christina Silver. I have been using MAXQDA for many years, since before it was called MAXQDA even. And I work at the University of Surrey in Guildford in the UK in the sociology department, where I manage the CACDAS networking project. Some of you may have come across it. We basically provide information, advice, we raise awareness and build capacity in the use of digital tools for a whole range of different qualitative and mixed methods approaches. So through that project, have done quite a lot of work with MAXQDA over the years and used it in my own research as well as other digital tools as well. And I also do quite a lot of my own research and consultancy and training through my own business as well. So you can see all of my contact details up on the screen. Do connect on social media, or feel free to send me an email if you have any follow-up questions arising from our session today, or just want to have a chat about anything to do with MAXQDA. I'm always happy to engage in those kind of communications. Okay, so what are we doing today? So we're focusing today on thematic analysis, but specifically how we can use the tools that MAXQDA provides us to undertake thematic analysis. Okay, before I get going, I'm just going to touch on something that came up in the chat from Nicholas earlier about what is thematic analysis actually. And you can see on there that I've got an umbrella because thematic analysis, that term is like an overarching term which actually kind of hides a range of different approaches. Okay, it's actually got quite a long history, the kind of tradition of thematic analysis, and it has been popularized in the social sciences and the applied research setting by two authors, Braun and Clarke, who published an article in 2006, which has been highly cited. But they also talk in their most recent publication. They published a book there that you can see on the screen at the end of last year, where they fleshed out their approach to thematic analysis in the most detail that they've ever done before. And there is quite a lot of debate in the field about whether thematic analysis is a distinct approach to analysing qualitative materials or a set of kind of procedural techniques, and also whether it's the same or similar or different from other approaches. So qualitative content analysis, framework analysis, template analysis, they are terms which are often used by different authors to mean very similar things to thematic analysis, but different authors approach this kind of methods toolbox that we have at our disposal in very different ways. So I think the direct answer to the question that Nicholas asked earlier is that you really need to read what the authors themselves say about how they understand the method and how they undertake it, because these terms are used differently in different contexts, in different disciplinary contexts, in different countries. So definitely terminology is a something to think about. And actually in Braun and Clarke's book, and their approach to what they call now reflexive thematic analysis is what I'm going to focus on in this particular session today, but a lot of what I say is relevant to other flavors, if you like, of thematic analysis. But in their book, in the introduction, they talk about distinguishing three traditions of thematic analysis that share very similar principles, but maybe have slightly different specific techniques or procedures. So yes, it's a kind of broad field, which is somewhat contested and debated. Okay, so as I said, I'm just focusing on their recent description of reflexive thematic analysis. The reason I've chosen that one is because in half an hour, I've got to make a choice about what I'm going to focus on. And it's a very popular method at the moment. Their book is receiving a lot of attention. So I thought there might be some interest in looking at this specific approach. But hopefully, if you're working in a slightly different context, there'll be elements of what I discussed that are transferable for you. Okay, so that's a little bit of initial setup. So what do they say about what they're now calling reflexive thematic analysis? Well, they talk about there being 6 phases of this approach. Okay, the first phase being familiarizing yourself with the data that you have. The second phase is to do with coding, qualitative coding of those materials. The third phase is to do with generating what they're now calling initial themes, then developing and reviewing those themes, and then refining, defining and naming those themes in phase 5, and then finally writing up. Okay, the thing that you notice here, if you're new to thematic analysis, is that they're not talking about data collection. Okay, they're just talking about the analysis. So thematic analysis is very much a particular phase within the overarching research cycle, if you like. Okay, so that's the high level description that they give of the 6 phases of reflexive thematic analysis. So what am I going to do today? What I want to do today is I want to kind of power up the way that we think about thematic analysis in terms of how we can really use MAXQDA tools. Okay, not everybody who does thematic analysis is using software like MAXQDA to undertake the analysis. In fact, Braun and Clarke themselves don't use software. They do mention it in their book, but they prefer to work manually, and they're very famous for saying that. So what I wanted to do today was to show that you can take their approach that they undertake manually using highlighter pens, etc. on hard copy text. You can transfer that into the context of using MAXQDA, okay? But as a disclaimer, I'm not saying that you can't do good quality thematic analysis if you're working manually. Of course you can. And you can also do bad quality thematic analysis using MAXQDA because essentially we are the ones who are doing the analysis. The software provides a whole range of tools, which I do believe help to make the process more rigorous, allow us to access our materials in various ways much more powerfully. But you can do good analysis without good thematic analysis without using MAXQDA, and bad thematic analysis with using MAXQDA. So what I really want to do is to start to open up that toolbox and think about, okay, what does that look like and how can the software contribute? So I'm going to take each of the phases that they describe and take their own words and break down and think, okay, what does that actually look like when we work inside the software? One last disclaimer is that there are probably alternative ways of accomplishing the phases that I'm going to go through from the ones that I talk about today. And that's one of the beauties of MAXQDA, isn't it, really? Because it's a hugely flexible and powerful toolbox. I think about MAXQDA as like my garden shed. It's full of tools that I can pick and choose for various tasks. And there may be certain things I want to do at a particular phase in a thematic analysis that I could accomplish in several different ways using several different tools. Okay, so you may have alternative ideas of how you might accomplish something from what I talk about today. Really, it's about opening up our minds and thinking about how we can kind of systematize that process a little bit. Okay, let's talk then about the first phase. So the first phase, familiarizing yourself with the data set. So you'll see here that I've taken a photograph from the book. I've got the book here, I've taken a photograph and put it in a screenshot, and I've highlighted a couple of aspects in each of these descriptions in 2 different colors that you can see there on the screen. The red highlight is the kind of tasks that we might actually need to do. And the green highlight are the levels at which we might like to work. And I think that that's a really useful way to think about doing analysis, whether it's a thematic analysis or other types of analysis in our work. So let's just pause here, familiarizing ourselves with the data set. What does that mean? So Braun and Clarke say that here in this phase, we become deeply and intimately familiar with the content of our data through a process of immersion, okay? Practically, they say that this involves reading and rereading our data. And if we were working with transcripts of audio data, listening to the recordings multiple times and making notes about the analytic ideas or insights that we have when we are immersed with those data, when we're reading them over and over, okay? And we make those notes both related to each data item, by which they mean a segment of data, and the data set as a whole. And for me, those are two different levels at which we might like to work. Okay, so that's how they describe it in a methods way. What does that look like if we were to do that inside MAXQDA? That's what I want to focus on. So I like to think about that in three ways, okay? How can MAXQDA help with this familiarization process? First of all, what do they mean by immersion? They mean working right at the nitty-gritty of the data level. So if they're working with transcripts, that would be making little notes and scribbles and circling things and using different highlighter pens. And we can do all of that kind of work inside MAXQDA. And we can do that in what I call a slow, low way, okay, which is the equivalent to how we may do it if we were working manually. Or we can do it at a fast, high way, okay? And that gives us opportunities that are difficult to achieve when we're working manually. So I want to talk about both of those, the slow, low way, maybe highlighting. So we can highlight inside MAXQDA in various ways, similar to how we might do it if we were using highlighter pens. I still have highlighter pens, by the way, even though I spend lots of time inside software. And one thing that's really neat about the new version of MAXQDA, I think, is, and I'm going to show you a screenshot of this in a moment, is that we can do the highlighting in Word or on a PDF file. And then when it comes into MAXQDA, when we import it into MAXQDA, that gets transferred into the software, which is really, really nice. So even if you like to work with that kind of tactile, touchy-feely way with your data in hard copy, you can still work in that way and then bring it into the software. Okay, so that's what I mean when I say highlighting before import or after import. And that's the slow, low reading and marking and thinking about the data. But then we've got this higher level work, okay? So MAXQDA provides us opportunities of reading and rereading much more quickly than what I've just described. And in particular, there are a group of tools. These are not the only ones, but the ones I'm going to show you today. MAXDICTIO tools, word frequencies, word combinations, and the interactive word tree allow us to do a very similar thing. We're still very much immersed in our data, but we're working faster and higher level. So let me just bring that to life a little bit and show you what a few of these things look like. So here what we've got is a screenshot. This is actually from a tweet that I posted when I first played with this, when the new version was released a couple of months ago. So you can see on the left-hand side, any highlighting that you do in a Word file. This is a transcript of a speech. So that's highlighting a Word file on the left-hand side. And also comments on the right-hand side in Word. When you import that transcript into MAXQDA, it turns the comments into memos, which are linked to the data segments. And you can see that on the right-hand side of my screenshot here. And also it turns those highlights into highlights in MAXQDA. But those highlights are the same colors as you had previously, but they are also coded. And that means that if you've got multiple bits of yellow, so you can see the multiple yellow highlight here, they both get coded at the yellow highlight, and that code can later on be retrieved and worked with like any other codes. So that's one example of slow, low exploration, being immersed in the data before using MAXQDA, but being very integrated with it, okay? That's not to say that you can't do the work in MAXQDA. You don't have to start off in Word or a PDF file first if it's text. You can do all of this work inside the software as well. And what you'll see towards the end of my presentation is it's the access that we have to all of these markings up and notes that we've taken that provide a really useful access to our materials very systematically later. Okay, so that's one example of that slow, low exploration or immersion. What does it look like when we do high, fast? I am an advocate of using word frequency and other similar tools to explore my data on a high level. The fact that some words are happening more often, maybe I don't want to quantify in a thematic analysis on the basis of presence of words, but still knowing that some words are occurring more frequently than others is potentially useful. And the word combinations, this second screenshot that I brought up here is showing us frequent phrases that occur in the materials. I haven't told you anything about these materials today, but this is actually sample data that Braun and Clarke use in their book to illustrate their process that you can download from their companion website. And I've done that and have been using that to generate the slides for this spotlight session. So high, fast is giving us, still allowing us to think about and familiarize with the data. We're just doing it at a different level. The next slide is the third way that I want to talk about, which is kind of like a hybrid between the two, because I can use the interactive word tree here in order to quickly find words or phrases. So in this screenshot, I searched for the phrase choose not. This data is all about the choice to have children or not. So I searched for the phrase choose not in order to explore what was being discussed. These are Facebook posts. And it very quickly finds all of those instances, and it's called an interactive word tree because it's connected to the data. So on the right hand side, you can see the instances highlighted in yellow, but you can also access those within the original data context as well, very quickly, very easily. So for me, this is like a hybrid that kind of allows me to traverse the high, fast, low, slow idea that I mentioned. And actually that interactivity is something that's really, really powerful in MAXQDA, because whenever you're seeing data in different windows, maybe from the word frequency or any other display, you've always got the ability to go back to the context. You're never disconnected, whatever you do with your data, from where it came from. And for me, this is by far the most powerful reason to use MAXQDA, because whatever I do with my data, however I'm pulling it out to look at it separately from where it came from for whatever reasons, I'm always able to get back at it. And that's something that is actually quite tricky and quite time consuming when you're working manually. So this is just an example. This is an example showing that you can also search not in a visualization, but in a list view for words or phrases that you're interested in. And it will show you both in a pulled out view. This little window here has pulled it out so I can see all of the hits separately, but they're always connected and very quick to get in. So that's a few ideas for that first familiarization phase. Okay. The other thing that we can do, though, is to make brief notes about analytic ideas in this phase, okay? And I want to talk about that in relation to tools that we have at our disposal in MAXQDA at different levels again. So paraphrases and comments allow us to do this at the level of what Braun and Clarke call a data item, what MAXQDA calls a data segment. But also we can do that using memos at a higher level. Okay, so they talk about familiarizing by writing at the data set as a whole, and we can do that using memos. And then the second set of bullet points on this slide are to do with things additionally that we can do with those notes, how we can visualize them if we're making those notes inside MAXQDA rather than in hard copy. So let's just have a quick look at what some of these things look like. So some of you may be familiar with the paraphrasing tool. It's an excellent tool, and it's designed exactly for this kind of purpose, whereby I can select some data and make a little note, and that not only gets added to the margin, so I can see it very similar to how a comment might work in Word, but what also happens is those segments of data that I've paraphrased are also coded, and that means that I can pull them out and look at them and review them again multiple times later on, and do various other things with them that I will touch on shortly. But there is a tool specifically for that purpose that has lots of very powerful affordances that we'll see in a moment. So that's paraphrasing. We've also got commenting, which is similar in some ways, but we're commenting on already coded segments rather than creating the comments first that then get coded. So slightly different emphasis in terms of the sequencing, if you like. But here's an example of some yellow highlighting that may have come in from outside, or I may have created it myself inside MAXQDA. And those highlighted segments can also be commented upon, and that's showing you here. And every time I retrieve that coded segment later on, I'll always be reminded about that comment. So at least 2 tools that we have which are specifically designed for that purpose. What can we do at that higher level that Braun and Clarke talk about? We can create a memo. Okay, we can create a memo. This is an example of a memo that I've created and associated with the data itself. So we can create a memo. Memos are basically like little sticky notes, little post-it notes that you can stick all over the place in MAXQDA, and also have them gathered together in the main memo system. But this is a space where I could do that work, where I could be starting to write my summary of the data set in its entirety. So several different tools there that allow us to make notes, but importantly, those notes that we make are connected to the data that prompted those thoughts. And that's the thing that's really powerful inside the software, in my opinion. Okay, visualizing notes. Okay, here you can see that I have got up on top here, I've opened up that paraphrase code that I showed you earlier, and it's showing me, this is at an early stage of the project, that I've got 4 paraphrased segments. At the top here, it's showing me the highlighted one, the actual data segment, and I can also see what was written in there associated with it. So you can pull them out and see them all together and get them out of MAXQDA onto hard copy if you want to. Very easily using the export icons at the top that you may be familiar with, but also those are always embedded at the data themselves, and that will never be lost, that connection between those different bits of insight that you've generated. So a multitude of different tools at our disposal for that first phase in their reflexive thematic analysis process. Phase 2 is coding. I'm sure you're all aware that there are many tools for coding inside MAXQDA. I'm slightly running out of time already, so I'm not going to read this out. You can watch the video again and pause it if you want to read the detail of what they say about the method of coding. What I will do is just flick straight on to showing you a few examples of the tools that we have at our disposal that can help in this phase. So for me, first of all, I want to make a couple of comments about how in MAXQDA we can build in phase 2 on the work that we've done in phase 1, because we can categorize paraphrases. And I've got a screenshot to show you that later on. Or we can code entirely separately from the familiarization work that we may have done in the previous phase, whether we did that in memos, paraphrases, or comments. So we have complete flexibility about whether to integrate those two phases for one to build on the other, or whether to keep them separate. And that would be a choice that you would have. Often it's useful to build on things because then we can revisit the data multiple times. And I will also show you, as well as a couple of ideas about coding paraphrases, I'll also show you about capturing analytic meaning, which is what they talk about in terms of their code labels. So we can create our own code labels very easily in MAXQDA and change them as our thinking about the data develops. But there are also other ways beyond simple naming of codes that allow us to capture analytic meaning about our codes. And I think that's also really powerful in the software. The third element that they talk about when they describe this phase is to do with collating all of the code labels and the data segments together, okay? And they see that as a separate phase, okay? What we see in MAXQDA is that just automatically happens. It happens as part of the coding process. We don't need to think about that as a separate step in the process because of that interconnectivity that I mentioned before. So not a separate step is required. And this is really powerful because it allows for continual retrieval, review, and recoding, which is what we often mean when we talk about iteration in qualitative data analysis. So here is a screenshot of the categorized paraphrases tool that you may be familiar with, where we can start to generate codes. So in this example, these codes here were generated when we were looking at the paraphrases that we'd already created, so reviewing them again, and then coding. And just by drag and drop, you can add codes to those paraphrases. So that's the kind of building up, the layering up process that I mentioned. We can also code in a normal way in the main interface. So in this screenshot here, I could just select text in a document and drag and drop and create codes in that way. But I can also capture the analytic meaning beyond the code labels. So you can see in the example here, I've got very different types of code labels. But I can use memos to expand on what I mean by those codes. And here I've got an example. I often in a thematic analysis will have a code called reflexivity check. So you may be aware that reflexivity is all to do with thinking about your role as the researcher on the process of analysis. And I like to code segments of data that really are striking to me in terms of how I'm viewing the data and make notes and comments about that. But I can also use color. So you can see that some codes are colored. I can also create sets of codes. So in vivo codes, I've created those are codes which are using actual data as the labels, and they can be grouped into sets. So there's all kinds of different ways, color, hierarchy, you can see a little hierarchy here, labeling, all kinds of different ways to add analytic meaning on different levels of analytic meaning in our codes. So I think that that's really useful also. Then they talk about this collation stage as a separate stage, but as I mentioned earlier, that just happens when you code or make notes or whatever you're doing. It's all being compiled together so that you can retrieve it and think about it later. That's the basic principle behind how the software works with respect to coding. And here you can see on the screen that I've always got the visualization, but I'm also very easily able just to double click on a code. This is the planning ahead code I double clicked on, I think. And then I see here all of those coded segments in one place. And there are other places that I can visualize multiple coded segments, some of which I'll touch on shortly. But I need to gallop on to the next phase, which is generating initial themes. So Braun and Clarke talk about the need to identify shared patterned meanings across the whole data set. So in thematic analysis, the themes that we develop need to take account of the whole data set. So they talk then about compiling clusters of codes and reviewing and collating all of the data into what they call candidate themes. And MAXQDA is designed to help us with exactly those sorts of tasks. So let's break that down and think a little bit about how that might look, remembering, of course, that these are not the only ways that we might do this in the software. But we can use subcode statistics, the code matrix browser, the code relation browser, crosstab summary tables. They are all ways that we can identify shared patterns of meaning across the whole data set and break it down in different intersections, if you like. We can use code hierarchies, code sets, maps, and creative coding to play around with clusters of codes, to bring them together, to split them up, to reorganize them. That collation, as I mentioned before, is just happening as we go through that process. So some of those things that I showed you earlier are coming up in there as well. I'm just wondering if I've hidden a couple of my slides, because the next slide is not what I was expecting it to be. Oh, I haven't got any visualizations for this phase, because I've got the same visualizations in phase 4, because there's lots of similarities between those two phases in terms of the tools that you might use. So they talk about developing and reviewing themes, and my point, I think, is that the generation of the initial themes and the developing and reviewing them can happen kind of iteratively, incrementally throughout the process inside the software. So the slides that I've got here to talk about what they're saying here about assessing the initial fit of the data at each theme, checking that the themes make sense, revising them, and they talk about how radical revision is a possibility, and considering the relationship between the themes and existing knowledge. So that is attended to also by these tools that I mentioned in the previous slide. So let me show you a few of those. So here is an example of subcode statistics telling us some information. I happen to have the percentages here, but I could get the frequency of coded segments, so showing me which codes are occurring more often across the whole data set, so at the level of the whole data set. And here I've got an example of a code matrix browser, which is looking at a few codes according to participants. This data was Facebook data, so these are anonymized Facebook posters, not visual posters, but people who post. So you can see here that some of them, each column is a separate Facebook member. So some of them are mentioning certain codes more often than others. And I don't have a screenshot of it today, but you probably are aware from other sessions is that you can access the interactive quote matrix from here, which will put the qualitative comments that sit behind these numbers in a table. So you've got this really beautiful comparative view, which is so helpful when you're developing themes. Okay, compiling clusters of codes. So I'm aware that I'm going quite fast, but hopefully if you find this interesting, you can watch back the video and pause to reflect on it a little bit. There's all kinds of different ways that we can compile clusters of codes, and that can happen at any stage in our work, iteratively. It doesn't have to be a specific phase. Here's an example in a little hierarchy, so I can move codes into a hierarchy based on how I might be thinking about them. I can also recode. So here, one of my favorite tools in MAXQDA is the smart coding tool, whereby I can retrieve all of the data segments at one broad code, in this example, the planning ahead code, and then I can recode those into more specific detail. So if I've got a code which is maybe a little bit too broad, or I want to break that theme down into its properties and dimensions, then that can be accomplished very, very smoothly in the smart coding tool. You can also do it in other places as well, but that is my favorite one, which is why I've shown you the screenshot of it. We can also compile clusters of codes in a visual way using maps. And here's an example of a map showing some of those codes. The thicker the line, the more codes occur, and also showing us co-occurring segments as well. So lots of different ways of working with themes, and that kind of continues on into their next phase, phase 4, developing and reviewing themes. I'll just jump over these this list here. These are just some ideas. Again, many of them the same ones that I've mentioned in the previous phases, because I see those 3 phases that they have as distinct phases as being much more fluid when we're working inside MAXQDA. Although, of course, if you wanted to keep them entirely separate, you could do in MAXQDA as well. So here is another example of a map. Being able to visualize the actual coded segments in a map is really useful, because it means that you can move things around and start thinking about how you might cluster sub-segments into other codes maybe. And of course, we also have the wonderful tool Creative Coding, which is really designed for that kind of radical revision in terms of where the codes sit in our organizational code system. So this is just showing you the beginnings of that process. So here you might have unorganized codes, and then you want to kind of pull them together and start thinking about how they might be related. So all of that work, those 3 phases of theming are really useful. And then there's another one, refining, defining and naming themes, that they think of as a separate phase. Again, this can happen along the way in many senses, but there does have to come a point in time when you start to solidify things and you start to generate your final themes, as it were. And they talk about writing synopses and having concise, punchy, informative names for each theme. And there are various ways in which we can use MAXQDA to do that. Many of them I've mentioned already. So hopefully what you're starting to see is that many of the tools in MAXQDA can be used for multiple stages of work in a thematic analysis. So I've already shown you maps. We've also got coding queries, which are really useful to help us think about whether our themes are clearly demarcated. We can use memos and summaries to write our synopsis of different themes occurring in different contexts. And of course, we can change our names and our code memos for definitions at any point. So hopefully you see that kind of iterative nature and how powerful MAXQDA is. The last phase that they talk about is writing up. Okay. And if you came to my summary session yesterday, you'll know that there are multiple places in MAXQDA for writing. And as I mentioned earlier, that writing up happens along the way because we've got all of these different places that we can write, and because those writings are linked to the data that prompted them. So here on my slide, again, I haven't got screenshots for these. Many of them I've already talked about along the way. But writing spaces in MAXQDA are integrated throughout our process. It's not a separate activity, or it doesn't have to be when you're using MAXQDA. So we've got several different writing spaces. You can see them listed there at the top: paraphrases, comments, memos, the project log, and summaries. And we have dynamic, grounded visual representations of our qualitative data and themes. So I like to think about how we can use the visual tools to bring our thematic analysis right up to life. So it's not just a paragraph, a few quotes, then another paragraph. The software gives us all kinds of dynamic ways. And we can also save the evidence that informs our thematic analysis along the way. We can export anything in all kinds of different formats. There's a new tool the QTT tool that's specifically designed for that kind of work. And we can also use the Smart Publisher to generate a report which has some structure. Okay, I'm way over my time, but I want to show you the next two slides because they're my favorite ones. So I'm going to keep talking, even though I'm slightly over time, which is that I want to say a few things about using MAXQDA for thematic analysis. So in my mind, it maximizes the flexibility that we have to work with our data when we're doing a thematic analysis because of that iterative nature of our work, okay, and that interconnectivity between everything. But also that word transparency is really important, right? So the first question that Nicholas asked at the beginning about the different terms that are used, or the different methods, the different procedures and different flavors of thematic analysis, that's really important. We need to be transparent about what we're doing. And as soon as you use MAXQDA, you can be far more transparent about what you actually do than you can ever be when you're working manually. And for me, that's really important. But my last point really is that we can move these pieces around, okay? We don't have to continue to think about analysis as a linear process. Everything is interconnected. We can move things around. We can play with our data in all kinds of ways, still adhering to the philosophy and the principles of thematic analysis. We can follow it strictly if we want to, or we can borrow from different methods. And I think that software like MAXQDA gives us that kind of flexibility, which is really, really useful. Okay, the last slide is just some references. So there's also some great examples in some of the MAXQDA Verbi publications as well that you should look at. And there's an example of thematic analysis in one of my textbooks as well. So those three resources particularly might be useful. But I will stop there and have a look and see if there are any questions. I'm sure there are. I haven't been looking at the questions. There's probably too many for me. Okay, I'm going to start. What should I start at the bottom? Okay, so the first question I think I probably answered along the way. Borgella, what are the pros and cons of completing thematic analysis manually versus using MAXQDA? I think you've probably got what my answer might be by listening along the way. I think there's lots of advantages of doing it in MAXQDA, and that's really all to do with access. I can get at what I've done previously and build on it in a much more concrete and easy and flexible and reliable way than I find is possible in manually, and that's the main reason. But there are also some things which are not just practically very difficult to achieve when you're working manually. Oh, good question here. I think it's definitely appropriate to ask that question about inductive, deductive. Okay, so thematic analysis is very flexible. Okay, so yes, I believe that you can do deductive thematic analysis and also inductive thematic analysis. You can also develop themes at different levels. So Braun and Clarke talk about different types of themes. They refer to latent themes and semantic themes. So different levels and different directionalities are definitely possible in a thematic analysis, but you need to be clear about why you're working in one particular way, or indeed combining ways. The software allows you to combine inductive and deductive thematic approaches. Reflexive thematic analysis, because of those stages, because it starts off with familiarization, tends to be thought of as an inductive approach, but it's not necessarily have to be so strict as that, I don't believe, because I think you can also work with some, at least some deductive themes as well in a thematic analysis. Sorry, I'm just looking at the question. Will you be showing how to make it? No, I didn't show anything live because I was going through that whole process. I decided that I definitely wouldn't have time if I went into the software as well, which is why I did the screenshots. But hopefully from the MAXQDA manual is really excellent about the how-to. So I would just go there and search for what you're interested in, and you'll find all the how-to stuff in there very easily. So there's a big question there from Lewis. How can you use MAXQDA for literature categorization? I don't think I can really answer that question in this spotlight. There was a separate spotlight about doing literature reviews. In fact, I think there's a few. So maybe the thing to do is to go and watch those ones back to answer that question. But the answer is that you can do it, but the how will be in other spotlight sessions, I think. For a PhD Viva, do we need to prepare all the coding based on each step? Interesting question. I think you need to talk to your supervisors and also think about what the expectations are of your examiners and the institution that you're working on. In my experience, it varies what's expected, but talking about how you develop themes, what those themes are, how they're defined, that's all part of the way that you communicate how you got from your pile of data to your account, your thematic account of the data. So for me, that's really important, that process to describe it. And in a PhD, you know, that's going to be particularly important. It doesn't happen as often as it ought to in published articles, in my opinion, probably because there's not enough space often, but in your PhD, that would be probably something that you would need to be able to communicate. But how you do that is something probably that you would need to discuss with your supervisor and maybe have a look at some different examples of other people's PhDs that have used a thematic analysis. Hopefully that's helpful. Joanne, what is a heat map? A heat map is basically, I showed you a table. Can I go back on my slides quickly? I'm not sure. But a heat map is basically darker colors or different colors to show concentrations of things. Here it is. So this is what this is a heat map, this table with colors. So in this example, the higher the number, the redder the cell. The cells that have no numbers are white, and then the bluer, the lower the number. So it's called a heat map because it's kind of concentrations. I think originally they were all on the same color, so it would have been darker, lighter blues or darker, lighter reds. So the hotter the color, the more is happening at that point in the data, if that makes sense. In MAXQDA, you get them displaying, as you can see on the screen. I think I've gone over time by 2 minutes. Maybe I should stop. The manual is on the MAXQDA website. If you go to the MAXQDA website, you should be able to find the manual. I can't remember what the menu area is, but hopefully one of the Verbi people can answer that question and tell you exactly where you need to go get it. You can also access the manual from inside of MAXQDA, which is really helpful as well. Will you be updating your book? I'm updating the other book at the moment, Matthew. So the 5-level one, yeah, hopefully will be updated, but not until I've updated the other one first. So one thing at a time. But in theory, yeah. Okay. I'm aware that there's other sessions starting in a few minutes and everybody needs a little bit of a comfort break before we go. I don't think I've answered every single question, but hopefully I've answered quite a few of them. As I said before, I'm more than happy. Let me just put my contact details back up again. I'm more than happy for you to contact me if you've got any follow-up questions. I'll also put my email address in the chat so that you can just grab it easily from there. If you want to ask any questions, I'm happy to help if I can.